what I calculate myself, knowing that Russia has about $40 billion left in its liquid part of the reserve fund now, and it needs $40 billion a year to finance a budget deficit of 2% of GDP.
So if it is preparing or considering, if that's true, that it's considering to sue for peace in 2025, what do you expect to see politically between now and then, and also what it might try to achieve on the battlefields and in the war itself?
Well, on the battlefield, what is important for Ukraine is to isolate Crimea. And we are very close to doing that. And this is an important development that reserves too little attention, partly because it's a piece by piece. And if Ukraine gets the right to use US ATACMS or German Taurus missiles, then they can easily take out the Kerch bridge to Crimea, and then Crimea is isolated. So it's not far from doing that. If Ukraine does that, Putin will be in a very poor situation at home. And that is what's important. What Putin clearly hopes for is not what is happening in the war. He is not going to make any breakthrough. He might take another little village in the eastern part of Ukraine. It doesn't change anything. He cannot take any significant town. These towns that we are talking about now, Pokrovsk, for example, had 60,000 inhabitants before the Russians had completely destroyed it, and the Ukrainians still hold it. So these are small towns that you hear in the news. What Putin is hoping for is that Donald Trump, his close friend, will win the US presidential election.
So basically between now, if it is to sue for peace between now and 2025, it's a waiting game for the Kremlin, is it?
Yeah, I think so. Russia cannot, as it looks now, win on the battlefield as long as the West provides sufficient financial and military support to Ukraine. And it does until the end of this year. Next year, it's still an open book. Will the US give a new supplemental budget to Ukraine? If Kamala Harris wins the elections, probably the US will quickly and quietly do that at the end of this year in the lame duck session of Congress. If Trump wins, that will not happen.
What pressures is the Kremlin facing in keeping the supplies of arms, weapons and soldiers to the front line?
It turns out that they don't have munitions themselves. So they have to rely upon North Korea. So this head of Ukrainian military intelligence, General Budanov, when asked what is most important in terms of deliveries to Russia, he said North Korea. After that comes nobody. After that comes nobody. So it's North Korea, millions of artillery shell that are important for Russia. And that also shows how vulnerable it is. So Ukraine has now bombed at least 3 big deliveries of North Korean munitions, hundreds of thousands of artillery shells. And this is coming back to your question, if Ukraine gets the right to bomb further in, take the railways between Siberia and Russia. There are only a few railway bridges that have to be taken out there. So bomb them, send out partisans and bomb them. This is what the Ukrainian military intelligence wants to do.
How effective do you think that permissions for use of those Western weapons for long-range bombing into Russia could be in terms of damaging and inflicting a decisive economic blow against Russia?
I don't think that it's the economic blow. It's more the psychological, that people feel that they are actually in war. Because until now, ordinary Russians have not felt that they are in war. You might have heard the reactions when the Ukrainians broke into Russian territory in the Kursk region, and people said, "Why are they attacking us? We haven't done anything." So this was the ordinary Russian reaction. Ordinary Russians don't recognize that that is Russia, is pursuing a war against Ukraine, and that Ukraine has a right to defend itself. But I always use one simple fact here. German military production peaked in July 1944. After the whole country had been bombed by the Allies for quite some time. So we should not hope that bombing or the war itself will stop the economy.
You said that the Russian population in general isn't feeling the war at all. What difference do you think it will make if they do?
You will have two reactions. The first reaction, as we have seen in Kursk, is that the support for the war increases. I was at Oxford when the Falklands War started, and I was amazed to see all the British students immediately standing up and supported this war that nobody had thought of even as a possibility just before. This is the normal reaction of any nation. But then you get people who say, what are we actually doing? This doesn't make sense. And here we would rather look to the top elite who are really deciding what is happening in Russia. And we will not know what they think, because if they think something bad about Putin, they would not say it, because then they would be out.
You believe that getting the long-range permissions to strike deep into Russia, coupled with an extra $50 billion a year from frozen Russian assets, could secure victory for Ukraine. Can you describe how you see that going?
Yeah, so first Ukraine needs this money in order to get its economy functioning. The Ukrainian economy is actually growing by 4% this year, and it did last year as well. So it's functioning surprisingly well. And so this is what you need the money for, and you need more arms. So you need long-distance missiles, particularly the German and US ones. The British Storm Shadow are very useful, but they are not as long distance as the American and the German missiles. And then to cut off Crimea, I think that Crimea is central for Ukrainian victory. And for Russian victory, it would be to wear Ukraine down, a war of attrition leading to some coup or government change in Ukraine. And it would be a very humiliating war. When I was in Kiev now 3 weeks ago, a typical line was that time is ending, we are dying quite fast, or victory, or not to be. These are the choices the Ukrainians say. So it's nobody who says we should stop fighting and negotiate. It's rather that if we stop fighting, then we are dead.
You mentioned sanctions. They've been in place since 2014 and have been tightened since 2022. How effective have they been? And what do you think has been most effective?
Most effective so far has been that Russia cannot borrow anything abroad. Its foreign debt has fallen by more than half since 2013, and Russia cannot borrow money for example, from China. The Chinese are very afraid of lending money to Russia because then they would become subject to US sanctions. And this means that Russia has to live on its own resources. And thanks to the West having frozen $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves, these assets are not available for the Russian government. So they only have what they have at home at the National Welfare Fund, and that is running out. So my argument here is that this money will run out next year if Russia only has a tiny budget deficit of 2% of GDP. So Russia does not have that many resources. And then Russia has the choice, cut what public expenditures, because they can't raise more money, they can't borrow significant amounts of money, so then they have to cut. And what will they cut? Expenditures on the population, probably, or on the military? Well, perhaps.
What effect is all of this actually having on Russia's ability to project influence and power?
It means that Russia is no longer a superpower. It is a very limited power. And that's the main thing that we need to take out of this discussion.
You write that the only sectors that are growing are the military and its related infrastructure. How is that impacting the rest of the economy and the lives of ordinary people? You're saying that actually at the moment things are available in the shops, and they are available, but presumably this cannot go on indefinitely.
No, we are seeing, for example, all production of Western cars has stopped in Russia. And this it hurts the most developed parts of Western Russia, St. Petersburg in particular. And airplanes, all the airplanes Russia have essentially are Boeings and Airbus. And they can't fly without reserve parts. And you can't get those parts legally. You can get quite a lot illegally, but it costs a lot and it's difficult. And more or less they are running out. So this means that Russia's developed economy is gradually, not fast, but gradually declining. And this will hurt the economic growth. And we are seeing about 1 million well-educated young Russians, mainly 20 and 30-year-old people, have left Russia, mainly in 2022, because they were afraid of mobilization. And these were most of all software engineers that are now fleeing, for example, to the United States, but basically to everywhere where they can get a work permit. These are highly qualified, sensible young people. If Putin tries to mobilize again, he will encounter a similar thing. So therefore, Putin is now trying to entice young Russian men to go to the military for very high signing bonuses. So in Moscow and St. Petersburg, a young Russian man can get $60,000 just for signing up for the military, which shows how desperate the situation is. So you have three big checks on the Russian economy. First, the finances that I've emphasized. Second, the technology, because the technology controls from the West are functioning and they are getting tougher and tougher. And the third is demography. People don't want to fight for Putin.
And they were targeting these Russian A-50, the equivalent of an AWACS plane. It's got a huge radar mounted on the fuselage. And this was enabling the Russians to see deep into Ukraine, to see basically all Ukrainian air activity up to Kiev and perhaps even beyond. As you know, as soon as Ukraine got aircraft into the air, they would be spotted by the Russians. When Ukraine is trying to attack Russia with its drones, they'd be spotted pretty quickly after launch by these Russian AWACS equivalents. And so Ukrainian military intelligence services started an operation to try and shoot down these AWACS to bring some parity to the air war. And they tried at first with an S-200 system. An S-200 system is quite dangerous for the Ukrainians to use because it's a static system. So they have to go, so they spend several days installing it quite close to the front line, about 25 miles from the front line. And then once it's fired, it leaves a huge it's a huge fireball, huge plume of smoke. And then you've got to kind of dismantle it all, and that also takes several days to do. So it's quite a dangerous weapon to use, which is one of the reasons they decommissioned it in the first place. But they anticipated the A-50's patrol route over the Azov Sea, and they tried to launch this missile to shoot down an A-50. And the first time they did it was unsuccessful, but it inspired the Ukrainian Air Force to use their Patriot anti-air defense missiles in a slightly different way. And they've pioneered this technique called a SAMBUS, which is when you use a surface-to-air missile system to drive close to the front line, anticipate strikes by Russian aircraft, and shoot them down as they're on their way to their target. So this Patriot missile system was successful in shooting down the first A-50 over the Azov Sea. The Russians were obviously shocked by this, and they moved their A-50s further back from the front line, started patrolling over Russian territory. But then the Ukrainians again used this S-200 anti-aircraft system, installed it again, and they shot down a second A-50 over Russia. And then they used it a third time to shoot down a Russian nuclear-capable strategic bomber. So this has really kind of put the wind up Russia's air force. So they've got this long-range strike capability, and they can hit these kind of large, important strategic aircraft. And what's been really important for it is since then, the A-50s haven't been flying at all. So it's taken away this kind of huge radar visibility over Ukraine. The Russians only had about 9 of these aircraft, and a lot of them are thought to have been cannibalized to keep the rest of the fleet flying because they're very expensive, $330 million a piece, these aircraft. But they also had very, very highly trained, experienced crew on board the 2 that were shot down and killed. So, that kind of experience is really difficult for the Russians to replace and train the next generation of people on to work on these aircraft.
That's really interesting. So this innovation by the Ukrainians is having and has had a significant impact on Russia's airborne surveillance fleet.
It's a really significant impact. Those huge radars, they can't see up to Kiev and beyond it anymore. So, when Ukraine launches its new F-16s, Russia won't necessarily be able to see them depending on where they are on the map. They obviously have very capable fighter jets that are capable of having their own radar and seeing stuff within that range. But these huge AWACS kind of aircraft are no longer flying at all over Ukraine.
And I suppose actually it's something we've seen from Ukraine really ever since the full-scale invasion of 2022, that they have been incredibly innovative. I mean, with drones, for example, the way they adapted low-cost commercial drones in the early days of the war and kind of pioneered new forms of drone warfare. And now we're seeing this kind of thing. It is something that the Ukrainians, I suppose, out of necessity have had to do.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, they're outnumbered, outmanned, outgunned. Russia has got more sophisticated equipment than them, so they have to use every means available to them. And if they've got a weapon, they will find a way to try and use it and update it and modernize it. And they have the engineers to do that. And so kind of using these tools in the right way as well. I mean, if they started shooting S-200s at Sukhoi jets, it would be pointless because these aircraft are very maneuverable and would easily be able to dodge them. But planning these missions very carefully, knowing the outcome they want, and then using these weapons appropriately has been something Ukraine has been very good at, particularly Ukraine's military intelligence.
On the broader issue of Ukrainian air defense, I mean, is it something that you think gets overlooked too much, particularly when we talk about, what more military aid Ukraine needs? People often focus, and I get why, on things like the long-range missiles, the Storm Shadows, the Scalps. We obviously have spoken a lot about the F-16s in the past 12 months, but actually, just air defense systems, crucial for Ukraine.
Absolutely crucial. I mean, Russia is stifling Ukraine's economy with these attacks on cities on a regular basis, hitting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, making it really difficult for Ukraine to function as a viable nation. And in order to do that, it needs serious air defenses. And we're talking about a huge country, so they need a lot of air defenses and layered air defenses to protect their cities. And one of the reasons that Russia is constantly able to have success in its strikes, even when Ukraine has effective layered air defense systems like around Kiev, they have to move things around. They have to choose where to defend because it's such a big country and they have a limited number of systems. And every time there's a big, missile strike like the one on the Children's Cancer Hospital, the West realizes that this is a problem and talks about it again for those 5 minutes and pledges something. But, the West pledged a lot of new Patriot missile systems after that happened, and only one of them has arrived so far. So these delays continue to thwart Ukraine's plans to try and defend its cities.
Just on the Patriots, I've heard some analysts say that there is a massive global waiting list for Patriot missile systems. And as a result, it is harder to supply to Ukraine, for instance, than it may seem in theory. And even though the Western allies of Ukraine have their own Patriot missile systems, they don't want to give them up because they're worried about their own air defense. Is that your understanding of the situation as well?
Well, that's something that's often talked about, and that's often a reason given as to why they can't be handed over to Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is saying that we don't need the state-of-the-art, up-to-date stuff that you're using and you want to use that can be integrated into modern NATO defenses. Give us whatever you have, and we'll put it to use. And that's one of the things that they constantly repeat is that the US has lots of Patriot batteries in storage. They may not be in working condition. They may need to be cannibalized to produce one battery, but just give them over and give as much as they have. And the question is also about prioritization. Yes, the West wants to make sure that it has enough Patriots to defend its skies, but is it more effective? What's the greatest threat to European skies at the moment? Is it more effective to shoot down Russian jets over Ukraine now, allowing the Ukraine to do that, than to wait for a kind of galvanized Russia to be able to strike the Baltics or some of the Balkan states, for example?
Just to look at the other side, how would you assess the effectiveness of Russia's air defenses currently?
But Russia has really effective air defense systems like the S-400, which is thought to be one of the best air defense systems in the world. And it has a lot of them. Ukraine has been taking them out, has been striking as many as it can, and they are high value target, high priority target for the Ukrainians. But again, Russia is an enormous country as well. So it has to make choices about where it places its air defense systems. If air defense crews are a bit lazy or careless about how long they keep their radar on, they can be targeted. So they need to shut down their radars when they're not using them to make sure that they're safe. And that sometimes allows for gaps in their defenses. And Ukraine has been very clever about using these relatively cheap drones to attack multiple different targets in different areas of Russia, kind of pulling the Russian air defense systems into different directions so that the Russians don't know exactly where the Ukrainians are going to strike and how they're going to strike. And the Ukrainians are also quite effective at using kind of paired drones to identify where an air defense system is and then strike it immediately. And then that produces a hole in defense for them to strike an oil depot or something strategic like that, which we've seen them do to great effect, including in recent weeks.
Let's talk a bit about the latest situation on the ground. First of all, in Kursk. I mean, here we are, 2 months or so since Ukraine launched the incursion into Kursk Oblast. How would you assess its success so far?
So Ukraine had initial success, obviously, in surprising the Russians and making a kind of a political message. And I think it should have demonstrated to many in the West that the red lines that Russia had laid down about no attacks on Russia are a bit of a bluff, and the West probably should have thought harder about being able to allow Ukraine to use its missiles or long-range missiles against Russian targets. That the sovereign, sacred Russian territory argument doesn't seem to hold water. But the Ukrainians did miss an opportunity to cut off a key segment of a Russian force south of the same river. They had, they've taken out all the bridges along that river, and the Russians have actually been able to reinforce that and are now driving east into Ukraine's flank, which looks like a bit of a problem for the Ukrainians. So while there's still some attempts to advance by Ukrainians, they're not moving a huge amount of territory. The Russians are still in a position to kind of cut off some of the most advanced parties of the Ukrainian offensive. So it is an increasingly difficult situation for the Ukrainians. And in the meantime, the assault against Pokrovsk, which is a really strategic key garrison town in the Donbas, continues. And it's difficult to argue that the Ukrainians have seen their assault in Kursk pay strategic dividends yet.
Just on Pokrovsk, what makes it such a strategic garrison town? Why is it so important?
So if you take Pokrovsk, you've essentially cut off from the south the towns of Konstantinivka, which would then allow you to kind of flank Chasiv Yar, which has been a really good position for the Ukrainians. It's on heights, it's got a canal facing, they've held the Russians there for months. It's very difficult for the Russians to get around. If you can attack Chasiv Yar and Konstantinivka from the south, you can then drive up the road and you're looking at the Russians taking Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And Kramatorsk, since 2014, had been the headquarters of Ukraine's military in the Donbas, so the key part of Ukraine's military effort in the Donbas. And that would allow Putin to then claim his success in the Donbas. One of the key reasons that he started this full-scale invasion is to take the entire Donbas, the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. And if he's able to take Pokrovsk, that puts him a long way towards doing that. It also puts him on the borders of the Donetsk region, and it gives him an opportunity to drive further towards Dnipro, which is a really important town of 1 million people in Ukraine. It's been a hub for Ukraine's military as well, but a very important part of Ukraine's economy. And so the Ukrainians really do need to hold on to Pokrovsk. It's a really important strategic town, and it's been home to thousands and thousands of soldiers since the war in Donbas began.
And of course, a lot of people think that one of the main objectives of the Kursk incursion was to try and divert troops away from the front line in the east, Russian troops away from the front line in the east into Kursk to try and relieve the situation there. That doesn't really appear to have happened on any grand scale. As a result, would it be fair to call the Kursk incursion a tactical success, but at the moment, no more?
I think at the moment, they haven't had a great strategic success from that, unless it is about this debate on whether you should allow Ukraine to strike Russian targets with long-range missiles, and whether it demonstrates to the West that those red lines are not real. And I think we did see after the Kursk incursion that debate intensify, and talk about the use of storm shadows has been a really key debate, but it hasn't paid dividends yet. If it does, then perhaps it will have been a useful thing to do. And there are still things that Ukraine may have up its sleeves. I know some units that were defending Pokrovsk that have been moved to other places that are not they haven't been used again yet, and we don't know where they're going to be used. Is there a trap line for the Russians? We don't know. But the Ukrainians obviously don't disclose their plans in advance. And one of the key reasons the Kursk offensive was initially successful is because they kept it very secret.
It's an interesting word there, Ukraine winning this war. And there has been to me it seems, a growing narrative in recent months that this war is going to be hard for Ukraine to win. And people are talking about potentially the need for some kind of negotiated settlement, whatever that would look like. Are you an optimist when it comes to Ukraine chances? Can they win?
I am an optimist, and I do believe they can win. We've seen the fortunes in this war ebb and flow since it started, since Russia invaded in February 2022. Back in February 2022, Russia very quickly advanced to the outskirts of Kiev. I don't know if you remember seeing pictures of armoured personnel carriers arriving in the suburbs of Kiev and thinking, are they lost, or is this the first of an overwhelming force? And then the war went against Russia. They had to pull back all their forces out of the west of Ukraine. And then at the end of 2022, we saw a big Ukrainian advance up around Kharkiv, which really made it look as if Russia was losing the war. Then in the summer of 2023, Ukraine tried an ambitious push to regain land captured by the Russians, which wasn't very successful. And since then we've seen this dogged war on each side. And for a very important period in the spring of 2024, the US was arguing with itself about whether they should continue to provide the weapons that Ukraine needs. And that really put Russia on the front foot. Most of those weapons have been provided now. There is a fairly good flow of weapons towards the Ukrainians. But Russia has, unfortunately, gone onto the front foot, particularly in the western Donbas. That's kind of in the middle of the front if you look at a map of Ukraine. At the same time, the Ukrainians have pushed back, crossing the border into Kursk, occupying a surprisingly large slice of Russia, which may or may not have influenced the Russians' ability to push forward elsewhere. What is needed for Ukraine to win this war is continued long-term supplies of Western weapons and financial support. We've seen that Russia is beatable. We have this country, that Russia, which likes to portray itself as being an enormous, powerful, unstoppable, invincible country. We saw in 2008 they had enormous difficulty in prevailing against Georgia, a country of which most people have hardly even heard. In Ukraine, they've been struggling for 2 years to push back the Ukrainians. The Russians are far from invincible. They want to portray there as being no alternative to a negotiated settlement, which of course is good for Russia because they're occupying 20% of Ukraine, an area about the size of England. So if the war stops now, they've won. That'll be great for them. And we should continue to support Ukraine with a view to them winning this war. I still think that's possible.
And I suppose we should define what winning this war would look like for Ukraine. Does that mean returning to pre-2022 borders? Does that mean returning to pre-2014 borders? What is your analysis of what winning looks like?
Well, there's two stages to this. You'll remember from the beginning of the war in 2022, Ukraine proposed a peace formula which would have allowed the Russians to hold on to Crimea for a period of years while they talked about that, and to retreat to their pre-February 2022 boundaries while discussions went on. And Ukraine also said at that point it would agree not to join NATO if the Russians would pull back. The Russians weren't interested in that settlement. So I think the likeliest outcome is to focus on international law. And under international law, the whole of Ukraine, including Crimea, including all those areas that Russia occupied in the east in 2014, is part of Ukraine. If we start to undermine that basic principle, we are opening a Pandora's box of future conflicts, not just in Ukraine, but all around the borders of Russia, Kazakhstan, Estonia, Lithuania, even Belarus. All these countries will be quaking in their boots if Russia is able to hold on to that land that they seized illegally from Ukraine. It's worth bearing in mind that in 1997, Russia signed a treaty with Ukraine. It's called the Bolshoi Dogovor, or the Partnership and Friendship Agreement, and they recognized the borders of Ukraine, including Crimea. There is absolutely no doubt that this is all Ukrainian land, and that should be the basis of any future arrangement.
The thing is, Vladimir Putin is not going to voluntarily give up the land he has illegally seized. He will have to be driven out. And that brings us back to that point about whether the West in particular is prepared to arm Ukraine to the extent that needs to happen. And that doesn't just mean necessarily providing Storm Shadow and Scout missiles to hit targets inside Russia, where there still appears to be some reluctance. But it also means a more consistent flow of aid, because it has been very stop-start for the last 2.5 years.
It needs to be absolutely consistent to give Ukraine the chance to regain the land that's been illegally seized by Russia. And it's worth bearing in mind, as I said earlier, that Russia is not invincible. It's not impossible to beat Russia. If there was an interesting analysis recently of the deaths of Russian soldiers. Now, of course, should we feel sorry for Russian soldiers who are being slaughtered in vast numbers to keep Putin in power? We should feel sorry for them. It's not their fault, actually, that they're being thrown into the meat grinder in useless failed assaults in the center of Russia. But somebody did an analysis of 18,000 of those deaths that had appeared in the Russian media, so proven deaths. And they found that the average age of Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine had increased from 32 in 2022 to nearly 40 in 2024. So Russia can be beaten. They're running out of people just as much as Ukraine is. And the second point is that Russian power structures are also capable of fracturing. If you look at the history of modern Russia, you will see that there have been 3 coups or putsches against Moscow since 1991. In 1991, there was a putsch against President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. You may remember that. In 1993, there was another putsch, this time against President Yeltsin. And then in June 2023, there was a putsch by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who up to that point had been one of the strongest supporters of President Putin. And he actually said live on camera, you can find it on the internet, he said, all these reasons that we've been told for invading Russia for invading Ukraine. All these reasons we've given for invading Ukraine are lies. There are no fascists in Ukraine. There is no threat from Ukraine. We never needed to fight this war. So Prigozhin, who was head of the Wagner mercenary group, turned against Moscow and started a march on Moscow, which was eventually bought off with vague promises, and he was then assassinated a little while later. But why do I mention this? Because the Russian elite know full well that this war is a total waste of time. It is weakening Russia. It is costing enormous resources. The economy is in trouble. They have awful demographic problems in Russia. Their population is falling like a stone. For all these reasons, they know that this war is wrong. The question is, could Putin be overthrown? Could people decide enough is enough? It'll be very difficult, as you say, while Putin's there, but it's not impossible that if the war goes a bit more badly for Russia, that Putin could be gone.
One of the reasons we've consistently heard from Ukraine's allies in the West against providing more military aid is this fear of escalation. And by all accounts, the White House's hesitation currently over providing long-range missiles for use inside Russia is again this fear of escalation. And yet a lot of people say, well, hang on a minute, all of Putin's so-called red lines appear to be a bluff. As recently as August, Ukraine physically invaded Russian territory with the Kursk incursion, and Putin did not reach for the nuclear button.
Yes.
How should we respond to fears of escalation and these red lines that Putin draws?
Excellent question. Well, first of all, Putin adopts a policy, funnily enough, which Dominic Cummings used to use when we were negotiating Brexit, called the madman strategy, which is that you do things so stupid, so crazy, that your opponents or people you're negotiating with think, bloody hell, this guy's really dangerous. We better be careful what we do. And so Putin has been rattling the nuclear saber since 2014, the whole time. And on the one hand, we do have to take these threats seriously. It's not impossible that Putin would do something so stupid as to use a tactical nuclear weapon. It's highly unlikely because Putin knows that if Russia were ever to use a nuclear weapon, he would be making the world a much more dangerous place for Russia, because every single country around Russia would have to get their own nuclear weapons if they saw that happening. They would be much more ready to use them against Russia if Russia were to break the taboo of using nuclear weapons. So it would be extremely dangerous, and I would say improbable for Russia to use them, but you can't rule it out. On the other hand, let's look at the history of this. In 2008, Ukraine applied to join NATO. There was a summit in Bucharest in Romania where some countries, such as the UK and the US, thought that Ukraine should be given the right to join NATO. And some other countries, France and Germany in particular, thought this was too dangerous. It was too provocative to Russia. We shouldn't take that risk. And they prevailed because decisions were taken by unanimity in NATO. And it wasn't a stupid position that France and Germany took because, for the reasons I've said earlier, we don't want to provoke countries unnecessarily. It's an interesting question to reflect on now. What would have happened if Ukraine had been able to join NATO in 2008? Whether that would have meant Russia never attacked them back in 2014. Very interesting question. We'll never know. Take it forward a bit, and from 2008 right up to at least 2016, that is after Russia's first invasion in 2014, Western countries were very hesitant to give any offensive weapons to Ukraine. They were giving them field hospitals and night vision goggles and uniforms, anything that wasn't lethal, to help the Ukrainians to resist a possible Russian attack. But they didn't want to do anything too provocative. And I remember sitting in the embassy in Vienna in 2016 when we had Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson visiting and talking about the war in Ukraine. And he said, what do you think we should do? You've been ambassador in Kiev. And I said, we should arm Ukraine to the teeth, because the only language Russia understands is force. And the only reason that they won't attack Ukraine is because it's too painful and too bloody for them. And unfortunately, those who said, well, we mustn't provoke Russia, won the argument back in 2016, right through until 2022. Luckily, in the year before 2022, the West did provide some anti-armor missiles, anti-tank missiles, and some more lethal equipment And that did help slow down the Russians when they attacked. And then, since 2022, we've seen a series of red lines crossed, and nothing very dramatic has happened. Russia always says, now we're going to respond with hammer blows, but actually their conventional forces are just not that strong.
It's interesting you talk about your experience as UK ambassador to Ukraine. Looking back, where else could the West collectively have acted with more foresight when it comes to Russian aggression?
Well, it's always good to have hindsight, isn't it? It's easy to see what could have been done before. I think the first big wake-up call was when Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. And in that case, one can debate the degree to which Russia and the degree to which Georgia were responsible for the outbreak of hostilities. Certainly, Georgia was playing a much more provocative role in 2008 than Ukraine was. Ukraine wasn't doing anything provocative at all in 2014. But when we saw Russia go into Georgia, the first thing that I thought, I'd just arrived as ambassador in Kiev at that time, was Ukraine's going to be next. So we were thinking, what can we do to stop that happening? And one of the things we tried to do was to build up the Ukrainian economy, including particularly in Crimea, in the hope that if people were better off and saw the economy going better, there would be much more resistance to a Russian invasion or Russian takeover. And what we saw, actually, interestingly, was that in 2011, there were elections in Crimea, democratic elections, and there was a pro-Russian party there called the Party of Russian Unity, whose leader is actually now the Prime Minister of Crimea under Russian control. And that party in the 2011 elections got, do you know how many percent it got?
I don't know.
It got 4%.
Wow.
So, the number of people who were actually seriously pro-Russian, even in Crimea, which is the most pro-Russian part of Ukraine, was relatively modest. And I remember being in Crimea in around 2009. I was being driven around by a taxi driver who was a former Marine from the Russian Black Sea Fleet, so he was as Russian as they come. And I said to him, there was a controversy at the time about whether street signs should be in Ukrainian or in Russian in Crimea, because most people there spoke Russian, even if they were Ukrainian. So I said to this taxi driver, what do you think about this? And he said, I don't give a toss, frankly, whether it's Ukrainian or Russian. It's fine as it is, he said. So the idea that there was a pent-up longing to return to Russia is completely false. And even more so if you look at Donetsk and Luhansk and the eastern part of Ukraine. I used to go there regularly. I went there for the Euro 2012 football finals. And in those days, you had beautiful stadiums and people going happily to watch the football. And I even went to a Beyoncé concert in the Donetsk stadium. I mean, you may say that's a cruel act or not, but people were living rich, normal lives before the Russian invasion of 2014. Since then, the people of eastern Ukraine, the Russian speakers of eastern Ukraine, have been through hell because of Russia's invasion.
And just to talk about Crimea for a moment, from a military point of view, is Crimea actually the easiest of the currently held Russian occupied territories to reclaim, in the sense that because it's a peninsula, much of the Black Sea Fleet has been eliminated by Ukraine, which is a huge achievement given it's a country without really an effective navy to speak of. The Kerch Bridge, of course, has been attacked in the past, and if they were able to effectively render the Kerch Bridge as useless, is Crimea the easiest part of territory that Russia has seized to reclaim?
I can't comment on that. There are plenty of armchair generals who will give you very definitive guidance on that. But in my view, there has been a lot of talk of Ukraine regaining Crimea. And Crimea has enormous symbolic power for Ukraine and for Russia. It was the first place that the Russians marched in back in 2014. It is an area which occupation of which makes it very difficult for Ukraine to function as a normal country. It cuts off a great swathe of the Black Sea and a great deal of oil and gas drilling areas south of Crimea. So there are lots of reasons why Ukraine would like to reclaim it. And we've seen over the last year or two a series of highly effective Ukrainian strikes against Crimea. You've mentioned the Black Sea Fleet being sent to the bottom of the Black Sea. The Black Sea Submarine Fleet, it's sometimes called. We've seen strikes on the Kursk, the the submarine that was berthed in Sevastopol. Sevastopol has become almost unusable for the Russian fleet. So it's not unthinkable that Ukraine could retake Crimea, but I couldn't honestly judge whether it's easier to retake Crimea or easier in Donetsk or up in the north.
Let's talk about your book. It's called Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties.
Yeah.
What the Ukrainians would like is ideally European troops on their soil doing training, but also acting as a blocking position north of Kyiv. They thought they were going to get it earlier this year. Macron was up for it. Then Macron got emasculated in his elections, and that plan's been dropped. So, there's lots and lots of moving parts, and, we could see a major war in the Middle East sometime between now and, whenever this podcast comes out. So, there's a lot of stuff going on. Worth pointing out, last point on the Middle East, there are two US aircraft carriers in the Middle East. That's the bulk of US naval strike forces. That means they're not in Europe, it means they're not in Asia. So again, events can really change things. And most Secretary Generals have ended up facing a world they didn't quite expect to.
There's been a lot of talk this year about NATO trying to Trump-proof itself, or indeed Ukraine's allies trying to Trump-proof support for Ukraine. To what extent do you think that will be successful if indeed Trump does win again?
I mean, the first point is that the Europeans, and I would include the Brits in this, have not really got their defence industrial base together. The North Koreans are giving Russia about 3 million artillery shells a year. The combined industry of the US plus Europe cannot meet that, and it doesn't look like it's going to be able to meet it anytime particularly soon. The US are stepping up their drone production, so is Europe. But again, the US have have slightly deeper pockets, but no one has very much. So I think there are problems that go beyond Trump. The Ramstein process, which is now NATO has more of a dog in, it's not quite clear how it's going to work, but that's the process by which Ukraine gets weapons, is quite important. But actually, most things get agreed bilaterally anyway. The Trump administration gave Javelin, the anti-tank rockets, to Ukraine. A new Trump administration may well do the same thing. But the bigger picture is, and again, this is not really about Trump. It's about making sure that Europe is able to defend itself, because the Americans will have only limited clout, because they will also be in the Far East. If you look at what the Germans have done, the Canadians have done, both of which take a lot of flack for not spending 2.5% of GDP. They're both moving a brigade permanently into the Baltics, or at least permanently for the next few years, building base infrastructure there. That just means there's a lot of European and Canadian troops and American troops in Poland who you need to run over to invade the continent, and that's the kind of big tripwire. And I think Europe will be spending a lot more on defence than when Trump came in 2016, and he may well take that as a win.
I mean, I suppose it also raised the question, well, how much more should we be spending on defence? You've got the Conservative Party leadership contest happening in the UK now, several candidates pledging we need to go to 3% of GDP in terms of defence spending. Is that even enough?
I mean, I think we could burn 3% of GDP on nothing useful tomorrow. We're about the seventh largest spender on defence in terms of globally, and we just sent one of our 6 or 7 attack submarines. The first one went to sea for 108 something days. So a lot of our kit, we spend a huge amount of money. We don't get that much out of it. If you look at someone like Finland, who spends a lot less than us, I mean, a huge amount less than us, but they have a reserves that are about 150,000 strong, substantially bigger than the British Army. And essentially they do that by training up a lot of Finns to fight, and they wouldn't have the money to pay all of them in time of war unless they were to get budgetary support from the European Union. So they couldn't actually employ those people full time except in time of war. But in time of war, obviously they would, because it would be an existential battle. So I think, to be candid, the Finns are probably the upper edge for bang per buck in terms of what they get. The Poles are spending a lot, about 4% GDP, heavily on kit. That's probably a good shout. But again, there are questions about when that gets delivered. Is their industry up to it? I think it's more about what you do with it than how much you spend, to be candid. We spend a lot of money on things that don't work particularly well. There are certain things we have to spend a lot of money on. If Trump was to leave NATO, the British and French strategic nuclear deterrent goes from being a bit of a weird thing that the two countries have that doesn't really change the price of fish to the existential nuclear defense of Europe. And the French take that very seriously. And I think we would take it seriously in the event of leaving of Trump leaving NATO. And that means we don't have a lot of choice, but to actually build that's a huge amount of stuff. I think the biggest question, and I've alluded to it, is how fast can you scale? So to deter Russia, the first question is, can you give them a bloody nose when they come across the front? So the answer to that is yes, definitely with the Americans. It's a bit more challenging without, because particularly a lot of the air power that the Americans bring to Europe would potentially vanish. Your second question, and Ukraine has shown this, is can you still be in the fight in 3 to 5 years' time of a really long war? So Russia has a population of about 140 million. So clearly Ukraine now have less than 30 million. You can see what that means on the ground. European Union has 300 million. Now that means that in a battle of industrial strength plus human capital, which is what both world wars were, it's what the Ukraine wars turned into, the Europeans can outgun the Russians because there are twice as many of them. How does Britain play into that? Do we want to be in a situation where we can scale? I would say Britain has one existential threat that doesn't particularly relate to NATO would be gone in this scenario. We don't face an existential threat unless Germany and France get taken over by pro-Putin far-rightists. And if they did, and that's not an unthinkable prospect in the next 10, 15 years, then there's an authoritarian bloc that extends from the Korean Peninsula to the Straits of Dover. Now, under those circumstances, you probably want to have a much larger army and probably less kit, but more weaponry, if you see what I mean. Aircraft carriers not terribly useful in that kind of scenario. Lots and lots of infantry, yes. So, if you look at what a lot of countries are looking at is how you scale, that's not the way the British Army has ever really thought. And I don't think it's where, and it's not a partisan issue here, I don't think. You saw with Rishi Sunak suggesting conscription, it wasn't done in a very mature way. The world would have to get a lot worse over the next 3 to 5 years before Britain started thinking that kind of unthinkable. But if things did go that way, so for example, if we saw, an escalation into what we saw in Ukraine and the Baltic states, a long-running war there, then I think we would have to think very differently about defense. But that also means the Americans think about this a lot. It takes a very long time to build a ship. It takes quite a long time to build a tank. It takes quite a long time to train a sort of very experienced soldier. Your ability to restock has to be faster than that. So the Ukrainians were training soldiers, getting them on the ground in 72 hours during the invasion of Kiev, sometimes a bit less. Drones can be built faster than fast jets. So your industrial base has to not quite look like an old-fashioned industrial base, but you have to still be in the fight in year 2, month 3, year 3. And if you do that, you'll never have to fight the war because they won't come. And that's the question that lots of places face, and everyone faces it slightly differently. And I think the Strategic Defence Review here will have to engage with that. And it's going to be interesting to see what answers they come up with.
And just finally, Peter, how would you assess the likelihood of Ukraine becoming a full member of NATO in the next few years? I
mean, I think if I was Ukrainian and said either becomes a full member of NATO or becomes a full member of the Russian Federation on a 25, 30-year basis, if we're going to leave them out in the cold forever, I mean, it doesn't have to be NATO. They're more likely to become a member of the European Union. The European Union has its own territorial defence clause, and it has its own nuclear weapons through the French. So, it's not the only path. The only way that Ukraine would be able to accept politically losing large chunks of its territory would be if that came with a territorial guarantee. And then NATO is the best way of doing that. I think it's going to come down to the next president of the United States. It's going to come down to the current or next Chancellor of Germany. It's going to come down to the next president of France. I don't think most British prime ministers that we've had recently would have vetoed NATO Ukraine membership if other people were going for it. I think on a 20-year basis, it's probably inevitable. I think on a 5-year basis, it's probably about a 35% likelihood. And again, my instinct is that the deal to be done, I think, I don't know if it can be done, but if I was, is if Ukraine were to permanently abandon Crimea in return for NATO membership, then I think there might be a deal that everyone could get around the table for. And that has been the question that's been confronting people dealing with Ukraine since 1991 when it broke free, arguably since the 18th century when, the Brits fought a war over this in the 19th century, the Crimean War. So that has been the flashpoint for about 300 years. But as to whether anyone, this isn't just about Trump. This is about a Harris or a Sullivan or a Zelensky or a Scholz. As to whether anyone is willing to do that deal is another question. And of course, the other problem is that if we were to do that deal and the Russians don't stick by their word and they launch another invasion of Ukraine, then your children, my nieces, whatever, are on the hook to defend that place. And I don't know that there is a societal feeling here or Germany. The Poles would rather fight in Ukraine than Poland. That's very understandable. Germany, France, Portugal, Britain, that's a much more complicated question.
To what extent is this growing, I don't know whether you would call it an alliance, Andrew, but people do talk about this group of nations, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Do you think that's fair to group those countries in that way, first of all?
I do. I think it's important to have a clear indication of the changing structure of what Moscow is actively trying to do, and not only Moscow, of course, but speaking from trying to interpret Russian activity, there's a very clear effort to develop relations between Russia and Iran, Russia and North Korea, Russia and China, and again, not only. So Russia and Azerbaijan, Russia and Vietnam. Some of these work more successfully than others, but we should really be thinking in terms of Moscow's shifting strategic geography. I think that if we did that, it would be more helpful to interpret more helpful to us to interpret Russian activity on the global stage. And we shouldn't just treat them as an alliance, as the axis of evil, or as a dysphemism, let's just be rude about these people. It's a clear effort by Moscow to establish a different infrastructural architecture in the world.
And how much of this actually comes down to repositioning towards the Pacific in order to build trading relationships? A lot of people have focused on the state of the Russian economy in recent weeks. The ruble took a pounding in the wake of the Kursk incursion. Obviously, there are heavy sanctions imposed on Russia. Is that part of the motivation?
That's certainly part of the motivation. And I would, again, those things are accurate, so we don't need to worry too much about disagreeing with that. If we're trying to look at how Moscow views the world and therefore interpret what its activity is, Moscow is clear and explicit. There is a long-term geoeconomic contest underway about access to commodities, access to transit routes, and access to markets. And a lot of what you see Russian activity, how that plays out, is based on this interpretation of international affairs. So absolutely, it's about reframing Moscow's economic positioning. To the extent I would say that Moscow is positioning itself as a commodity champion in antithesis to our net zero.
That is very interesting.
So I think this is how we interpret, or how I interpret the evidence from what the Russian leadership is doing. It's not simply our economy has crashed or is being crashed by the West, although of course they call the sanctions economic blitzkrieg and so on. It's really about a much longer term shift in international affairs to protect Russia's position as a commodity supplier.
And just on the Russian economy, how would you assess the state of it currently?
Stronger than most people here suspect, and weaker than Moscow would like. We're not going to call the Russian economy dynamically innovative, and we're not going to go in that way, but at the moment it's been quite resilient. It has been shaped to be resilient to economic statecraft. So you mentioned 2014 as that time. Really, since 2014, Moscow has put a decade's worth of effort into making its economy statecraft proof, in inverted commas, so sanctions proof, and that's why it's been able to withstand a number of the sanctions, the increasing sanctions that it faces. Again, we're looking at protecting the strategic heights, so hydrocarbons, agriculture, weapons production, that kind of nuclear power, that kind of question. So I'll return. It's a long way round of saying not as flawed as we think it is, and not as strong as Moscow would like. But don't be surprised if the Russian economy grows at a rate of about 4% this year.
I want to move on to the way the Russian leadership will be viewing events in the Ukraine in a moment, but just briefly on the North Korea thing. Are there risks with the relationship with North Korea? I'm thinking, for example, about how the leadership in Seoul will be reacting and whether that then informs their approach to support for Ukraine, What are the risks for Russia if it grows closer to North Korea?
The risks for Russia, as with all strategic questions, are about the relationship not working fundamentally first. This is why I'm hesitant to talk in terms of alliance. We're only at the beginning of what, if we met again in 5 or 10 years, we might be able to call it an alliance. But we're only at the beginning of building that serious set of relations. So the first risk is that the two parties are unable to make their agreements really stand. I think that's what we should always remember with strategy, is that strategy is not simply a plan or a stated intention. It's the ability to resource it and then implement it. And that's a lot harder. I mean, making assumptions about the future, then planning for them, and then implementing them is difficult business. Everyone's always found it. I mean, in history, have found it that way. So the second order is that yes, it provokes a destabilization in the region, as you rightly mentioned, South Korea. So there is a double angle to this. Not only does it create instability on the Korean Peninsula, but it also has ramifications with South Korea. First of all, sustaining sanctions against Russia, and second, of course, supplying and providing support to Russia's adversaries. So you're absolutely right, James. There are a number of risks, but I think we have to speak of those in almost as, like you might say, towing and healing.
Yes.
We're thinking about that all at the same time, always. The intent, the problems, and the potential risks. The payoff is very serious for Russia. North Korea has a large submarine fleet. And as I say, the more important question is to also tune to agriculture, port development, and positioning in the region. So risks, yes. Potential strategic advantages over 5 to 10 years, quite high also.
Let's come on to Ukraine. Is Vladimir Putin happy with how the war is going?
It's a good question, and I don't want to sound glib, but you'd have to ask him that. As from what we can tell, the Russian leadership would have been much happier with the coup de main succeeding. As far as we can tell, there's been some dissatisfaction with that within the leadership. There's some evidence of it, I think, which we can point to. That being said, the Russian leadership has adapted to the problems it's faced and is now pressing quite hard to achieve a secondary and tertiary position. A lot of that will be related to some of the things I was mentioning earlier about infrastructure, about exports, about protection of the Sea of Azov, and so on. Is he happy with it? No, because he would rather it have gone a different way, in my interpretation. Is it leaning in Moscow's favour at the moment? I'm afraid to say it probably is.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.